So again, my name is Ruby, and we're so happy for you all to join us today. Our team, Samantha and Doreen, will be manning the chat box for you all. So feel free to add your questions or comments into the chat box, and we'll do our best to get back to you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So quickly, just so you know who we are, we have Doreen Nicholas, our Domestic Violence Response Manager. We have Samantha Hinchy, our Domestic Violence Response Coordinator, and then myself, Ruby Barraza. I am your Domestic Violence Response Coordinator also. So we're happy to be here today virtually with you all. Hopefully we can learn more about the dynamics of victim blaming and how we can go about interrupting it in our work. So quickly, some objectives for today. We'll explore some theories for why victim blaming occurs. We'll also examine the ways victim blaming hurts not only survivors, but everyone. And we'll learn strategies for ultimately, interrupting victim blaming. That is the goal. So I always like to start off this training by sharing this great quote from Judith Herman, who is a great trauma researcher, does a lot of work in the trauma field. You might have heard the book Trauma and Recovery, a really popular book that she's written. And I pulled this quote from that book where she says, "It is very tempting to take the side of the perpetrator. All the perpetrator asks is that the bystander do nothing. He appeals to the universal desire to see, hear, and speak no evil. The victim, on the contrary, asks the bystander to share the burden of pain. The victim demands action, engagement, and remembering." So with that, let's hear a story. Doreen is gonna do us the favor of reading the Highwaymen story. So pay close attention as she reads the story, and we'll ask you to fill out a poll shortly.
So I'm going to read a story. It's called the Highwayman story. Okay. Once upon a time, a husband and wife lived together in a part of the city separated by a river from their places of employment, shopping, and entertainment. The husband worked nights. Each evening he left his wife and took the ferry to work, returning in the morning. The wife soon tired of this arrangement. Restless and lonely, she would take the next ferry into town each evening after her husband left for work. Over time, she developed relationships with a series of lovers. Anxious to preserve her marriage, she always returned home before her husband. In fact, the relationships she had were always limited. When they seemed to become too intense, she would precipitate a quarrel with her current lover and would then begin a new relationship. One night, she caused a quarrel with a man we will call Lover One. He slammed the door in her face and she started back to the ferry. Suddenly, she realized she had forgotten to bring money for her return fare. She swallowed her pride and returned to Lover One's apartment to borrow the fare. After all, she did have to get home. But Lover One was vindictive and angry because of the argument. He slammed the door on his former lover, leaving her with no money. She remembered that her previous lover, whom we will call Lover Two, lived just a few doors away. Surely he would give her the ferry fare. Lover Two, however, was still very hurt from their falling out and the sudden end to their relationship that he too refused to give her the money. Now the hour was getting late and the woman was getting desperate. She rushed down to the ferry and pleaded with the ferry boat captain, who knew her as a regular customer. She asked if he would let her ride free this night and she would repay the fare the next night. The ferry boat captain insisted that rules were rules and he could not let her ride without paying. Dawn would soon be breaking and her husband would be returning from work. The woman remembered there was a free bridge about a mile further on. The road to the bridge was a dangerous one, known to be frequented by highwaymen. Nonetheless, she urgently needed to get home, so she took the road. On her way to the bridge, a highwayman stepped out of the bushes and demanded money. She told him she had none. He seized her. In the ensuing tussle, the highwayman stabbed the woman and she died. Thus ends our story. Now, there were 6 characters in this story: the husband, the wife, Lover One, Lover Two, ferry boat captain, and the highwayman. Ruby's going to put up a poll for you to answer this question. Which of these characters has the most responsibility for the wife's death?
So here I'm sharing the results. So most of us did answer that the Highwayman was the character that was most responsible for the wife's death. After that, most of us, the next character that we kind of gave responsibility to was the wife, interestingly. So if we think about it, right, who killed the wife, right? If we answer, well, the Highwayman killed her, then we have our answer, right? That is the person who was most responsible for killing this woman. Morals aside, right? However we feel about the wife's behavior, what she was up to, at night, the fact that she was being unfaithful to her husband, or that the ferry boat captain was, kind of strict with her and didn't want to, let her ride for free. Aside from that, we know at the end of the day, the person responsible for this woman's death was the person who killed her, right? The Highwayman. So thank you all for participating. We love sharing the story and just seeing what kind of responses we get. So we appreciate that. Little activity for you. Now let's continue. So what is victim blaming? Well, we, through our research, we kind of came to a definition, I suppose, on what victim blaming is. And it is a devaluing act that occurs when the victim of a crime or an accident is held responsible in whole or in part for the crimes that have been committed against them. Okay? And this blame can appear in the form of negative social responses from legal, medical, mental health professionals, as well as from the media and immediate family members and other acquaintances. So for those of you who are advocates or who work with survivors on a regular basis, we know victim blaming in and out, right? We see this all the time. Survivors may come to you and share some, examples or stories of them being blamed for the abuse that they've gone through or the assault that they endured. So we know what this looks like, right? But we also have to admit and be really transparent in the way that victim blaming also shows up in the work we do, right? Some of us might be complicit in the ways we victim blame survivors, right? Through the tone that we answer calls, right? Or the facial expressions we use, our body language, the type of questions we ask them, who we serve, how and where we do outreach, what kind of program policies we have, the language we use, not only with survivors directly, but with coworkers, with other professionals, how we disperse resources, and how we decide who deserves help, right? So again, we are in our field, this stuff comes up regularly, and not through just the perpetrators or the people causing harm, but we kind of are guilty of this sometimes too. And we know that this comes up not only in our shelters and in our domestic violence programs, our sexual assault programs, this comes up in a lot of other systems too, right? Our legal system and law enforcement is certainly guilty of it. Child welfare and other social services, our healthcare system, schools, our employers, landlords, faith communities, and family and friends do it too. Now, part of the work that ACES DV does is we have a survivor advisory council, also known as the SHARE committee, where a group of survivors, really are there to kind of support us in the work we do and look at the trainings and all the policies and things like that for them to give us feedback. So through creating this presentation, we surveyed SHARE committee members who are survivors on their experiences with victim blaming. And this is what they had to say. So a friend told a survivor, "You were an adult. Why couldn't you stop your dad from raping you?" Another friend to a different survivor said, "You are not a victim. You know how he is. You should not have gone back to him." Right? And these are friends, mind you. A coworker said this to a survivor of sexual assault. It was the young girl's fault she was raped. She was asking for it the way young girls dress now. And this was not about the survivor herself. This was about another story that they were discussing. But could you imagine, right? If you heard this, shared by one of your coworkers, knowing that you're a survivor, maybe you haven't disclosed your survivorship to someone else, that can make us feel pretty bad, right? So then we ask, right, why do we blame the victim? What goes on in our minds that we jump to this conclusion, right, where victims are in some part guilty for what happened to them? Well, let's go back to our social psychology days. For those of you who took social psychology, you might be familiar with these theories. So we'll start first with attribution theory. And this theory really looks at how we make sense of the world around us. And this theory suggests that people make causal explanations to explain events, right? How we come to describe, right, what happened and why it happened. And there's really two ways where we explain behavior or attribute behavior, and hence the name of the theory, attribution. One being situational attributions and dispositional attributions. So let's take a look at what those two mean. So a situational attribution assigns the cause of a behavior to some situation or event outside a person's control, rather than to some internal characteristic, right? So something outside of us is what caused this event to happen. Whereas dispositional attribution, it's the reverse, right? So this assigns the cause of a behavior to some internal characteristic of a person, rather to outside forces. So something about the person themselves is what caused this behavior, this event to happen. So let's give you guys some examples. So if we're situationally attributing, this behavior, right? I cut someone off in traffic because I didn't want to miss my flight. Okay, so I am cutting someone off because of something outside of my, my person, because, I was late to my flight. So the fact that I was late made me act that way, right? Made me cut someone off. Whereas if you're going to be dispositionally attributing my behavior, right? Sometimes we jump into this more often than we do situationally. But we say things like, well, that guy cut me off in traffic because he's a jerk, right? Something about him as a person caused him to act that way. Do you see the difference there? Where we tend to, as humans, especially when we're talking about ourselves, we tend to attribute things situationally about ourselves and dispositionally about others. So we tend to blame people for events and actions and behaviors for the way they are, rather than looking at perhaps the situation around them. Which leads us to this fundamental attribution error, or FAE. And this is where we tend to overemphasize, right? Just what I described earlier. We overemphasize dispositional or personality explanations for behavior, and we ignore the situational factors or the context. So a person's actions depend on what kind of person they are. So some examples here, right? Well, he's so pretentious. No wonder his car was stolen. Or he's such an inconsiderate person for not calling me back. Or she's so naive to think he would change. Well, he's an addict. It makes sense that he was assaulted. Or she was asking for it the way she was dressed all slutty.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. This goes back to the crux of what we hear and what we see as far as victims of domestic violence and victims of sexual assault. So if you go back to our Highwaymen story, and the woman had a sick child, and she went across the river to get some medicine for her child, and she spent all the money on medicine, and she didn't have the ferry fare. But she had to get home to get the medicine to her sick child. We probably would be a little bit more sympathetic and a little bit less victim blaming on that victim. Bottom line is she didn't deserve to get stabbed and die, whether she was getting medicine for a sick child or she was trying to make it back from having an affair. So a lot of times our moral compass, our belief about what people should or should not be doing colors our response to victims. So that's one thing as advocates we have to put on the back burner when we work with people who may have made some choices that you or I wouldn't have in their life. But our work depends on the belief that nobody deserves to be abused, period.
All right, thanks, Doreen, for the commentary. So as you can see, right, these examples that I gave here on the right talk about the ways we describe people's personalities as a cause for how they are or the situation that they find themselves in, right? So we also tend to make situational attributions about ourselves, right? We excuse our behavior for other reasons, right? Not because, you know, hey, I have really poor time management skills and that's why I didn't call you back, or that's why I was late to work, right? We don't tend to think that way, right? It's because there was traffic. It was, you know, there was a situation going on at home. It's because my alarm didn't go off. We tend to excuse our behavior about other things, right? We make situational attributions for those things rather than dispositional ones. And we all do it. It's common nature. It's kind of in our human nature to think and act that way. So then that leads us to situational attributions. And I have some examples here to kind of make that point a little bit clearer about the ways we kind of excuse ourselves from, you know, maybe some internal or personality characteristics when bad things happen to us. So, and I have here Mike the Situation from the Jersey Shore to illustrate this a little better. So some examples. Well, I hit him because he made me mad. Okay, so again, I am attributing my behavior to an outside force, the situational factor, right? This person made me upset, so I hit him. Or I'm abusive towards her because of my drinking problem, right? The situation is causing this behavior, not me. Or work is stressing me out, so I take it out on him. Again, right? Work being the situational attribution. If she hadn't been late to pick me up, I wouldn't have flipped out on her. Again, right? The situation is causing my behavior. Well, I can't control myself when girls wear things like that. So as you can see, I'm hoping these examples are making it a little bit more clear about the ways we tend to excuse our own behavior due to the context, right, or the situation around us. So here's another quote from one of our share committee members where a friend told this to her. You have to find out what made him start drinking, right? Maybe you should stop pressuring him to stop drinking. You are stressing him out. Okay, so again, this friend is leaning into that situational attribution, right, where they're attributing her partner's abusive behavior on the fact that he drinks. Now this leads us to the opposite, right, the dispositional attribution. So some examples here could be, well, she's a stripper. What did you expect would happen, right? Looking at the person's personality or maybe the reasons why they engage in certain behavior as you know, some characteristic about that person. Or he needs to man up and stop being such a pussy. We hear this all the time, unfortunately. Or she's a blubbering mess. She has to be lying. Or did you see how she was looking at him? She was such a tease. No wonder she got raped. Well, she's such a bitch. I don't blame him for putting her in her place. Okay, so these are all examples, right, where we are attributing what happened to this individual, or, you know, the event that happened, the behavior that, you know, transpired on the fact that this is the type of person they are, right? Something about them as a person is what led to this happening. So some more examples from our share committee members. A friend told a survivor, if you would have paid attention to the red flags, well, you shouldn't have worn those clothes. And a doctor told a survivor, well, you're just mentally ill. And a family member told a survivor, this is what happens when you are promiscuous and have a child out of wedlock. Okay, so some more examples here of the ways we attribute behaviors or events to a person's personality, right? The fact that they were wearing certain clothes, or they might have a mental illness, or describing that, the fact that you're a victim makes you mentally ill, which we know is not true, or that you're the values, right, that we have, having the belief system that you shouldn't have children out of wedlock, and maybe the fact that you do makes you a certain type of person. So all these beliefs and the ways we describe behavior based on the fact that this is the type of person you are. Which leads us to another theory. So generally, people want to believe that they live in a safe, stable, and orderly world. Now, the just world hypothesis is just that, right? Where the belief that we live in a just world, where people get what they deserve, good things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people. So you might have heard the expressions, you reap what you sow, or what goes around comes around. So these are just some examples of common adages that we hear based on this hypothesis, right? That people get what they deserve, you reap what you sow, what goes around comes around, that kind of idea. But we know this can be kind of problematic, especially if we've been doing this work a long time. We know that bad things sometimes happen to very good people, and good things can happen to actually bad people. So let's look at the ways we can kind of debunk this hypothesis. But we know that people blame the victims of misfortune in order to protect themselves from feeling vulnerable. So at the end of the day, right, this hypothesis makes sense as a way to kind of preserve ourselves, right? The fact that we hear so many terrible stories, of abuse and violence, people being assaulted, children going through some of this stuff, that gets us a little uncomfortable, right? We don't want to believe that those same things could happen to one of us. So we then engage in kind of this belief system where we think, well, that must have been something about them that led to this happening in order to protect ourselves from feeling that vulnerability. Which leads us to cognitive dissonance theory. So some of you might have heard this theory before, where we tend to seek consistency between our cognitions, right, our beliefs, our opinions, our values, our attitudes, and our actions or our behavior. And when there is inconsistency, we experience dissonance, right? We experience mental discomfort, and we strive to change either our cognitions or our actions to restore some kind of balance, right? To eliminate that dissonance. So something's got to give, okay? So to kind of illustrate this, I have a few examples, so bear with me. So let's say you are a type of person that is very involved in environmental activism. You want to preserve the earth. You're very invested in, learning about climate change and learning about the ways we can do better as a people to save our planet. But on occasion, you find yourself littering, right? Maybe you throw away your straw wrapper, right? When you leave Starbucks and you throw it out the window, or you ball up your receipt, after going to the grocery store and you throw it on the ground. That's gonna produce some cognitive dissonance, right? Because your belief system, right? The fact that you are very invested in protecting the environment doesn't line up with your behavior, right? The fact that you sometimes litter. So what do? Well, you can say, well, I guess I don't really care about the earth that much, right? Earth Day was last week, who cares, not me. And, continue your behavior to eliminate that dissonance where you're like, okay, well, I guess it's not that big a deal if I do it sometimes, right? The planet's not going to go up in flames, or I'm not going to spontaneously combust if I do this one time. So I guess it's fine. Or you change your behavior, right? You still hold that value and that belief that, you know, we all got to do our work to help save the earth and protect our climate. So I'm going to make every effort, right? A concerted effort to recycle, to throw away my garbage, to not litter, right? So then that eliminates the dissonance and we're good to go. Let's go through another example. So let's say you are a very, very honest person, right? Honesty is something you value. You strive to be a trustworthy, honest person, but sometimes you throw in a little white lie, okay? You know, your friend comes up to you and says, "Oh, hey girl, like, do you think you know, these polka dots match this plaid?" And you're like, "Yes, you look great. This is amazing," you know, but inside you're like, "Oh my God, she looks like garbage." That's going to produce some dissonance, right? The fact that you have a belief system and you value honesty, but you find yourself lying sometimes, right? Contradicting that belief system. So what can you do? Well, you can continue lying, right? And say, well, you know, sometimes lying is necessary, or honesty isn't something I value that much, actually. Or you can say, no, girl, those polka dots and that plaid looks tacky. You need to change because you don't look good, right? And you can stop that lying behavior and still continue holding that value of honesty, right? And eliminates that dissonance. So how does this apply to victim blaming and the just world theory? So let's say we believe in a just world, right? Where people get what they deserve, you reap what you sow, that kind of idea. But we know violent crime occurs every day around us, especially if we have been in victim service field for a long time. We know this stuff happens regularly. It doesn't slow down, unfortunately. That's going to produce some cognitive dissonance, right? The fact that we're seeing news stories and, you know, survivors who come to us with really awful stories of, you know, survival and them, you know, enduring some terrible violence, that doesn't really jive with the fact that we believe that, you know, you reap what you sow, or what goes around comes around. So what do? Well, you tend to engage in victim blaming behavior, right? To eliminate some of that dissonance. You ask yourself, well, why were they out that late? Well, they shouldn't have been walking around with all that money. Why didn't they fight back? Or well, maybe this is payback for something bad they did, okay? Now, what do? Well, we can also look back, right? If we remember those last two examples, we can change our belief system too. We can understand that, hey, you know, the world isn't fair sometimes. And bad things sometimes happen to very good people. And you know what? Maybe I can't explain why this happened or this, you know, crime or event took place, but I know that this person was innocent and they didn't deserve, you know, to go through this. And that will eliminate some of that dissonance. Now, we know that culture plays a big, big role in everything we do, right? And it colors a lot of our experiences. So I wanted to briefly touch on the ways culture influences victim blaming behavior. And a lot of it has to do with the concepts of free will and fatalism. So we know that victim blaming tendencies might be stronger in certain cultures. For example, American culture, we know that American culture promotes this idea of the American dream, right? Where you control your own destiny or you have free will. Where other cultures who might be more fatalist might recognize more easily that sometimes bad things happen to good people, right? For example, war, persecution, poverty, you know, disasters, you know, climate disasters, all those things. So again, it might be a cultural difference too, where some people of different cultures might engage in victim blaming more easily than others. All right, so we talked about what victim blaming is, how it kind of operates in our minds, the theories that go along with victim blaming. Now we gotta discuss why it's so bad, right? Why this hurts people. Well, we know first and foremost, it hurts victims, right? No brainer there. We know that victims who receive negative responses and blame tend to experience greater distress and are less likely to report future abuse. I'm sure some of you have know stories or have examples of this happening. And victims who have been blamed prefer to avoid secondary victimization in the future, so they don't report future crime. This makes sense too. Now, victim blaming it has a big ripple effect. So not only does it hurt victims, but it hurts kind of everyone involved if there's a crime being prosecuted, okay? So victim blaming impacts not only a confidant's willingness to support their decision, but also witnesses' willingness to testify, authorities' commitment in pursuing cases and prosecuting offenders, a jury's decision to convict, a prosecutor's decision to recommend incarceration, and a judge's decision to impose that incarceration. So if we're looking at it in like the legal context, we know the consequences can be very serious if victims are being blamed for what's going on or what the crime that was committed against them. But we know everyone else is vulnerable too. When we see that victims are blamed for what happened to them and that they don't report, that crime, and those victims don't receive justice, the justice they need and deserve, we accept that as the status quo. And that puts us at risk of engaging in future victim blaming. And really keep in mind, right, that domestic and sexual violence can happen to any one of us, including ourselves. And it's kind of an uncomfortable thing to come to realize or recognize, but that is the truth, right? None of us are immune to experiencing violence. And how would you like to be treated if it happened to you, right? Would you want to be blamed for the crimes that were committed against you or the violence that you endured? No, right? So to kind of give this a more visual look, I'm a very visual learner, so I'm hoping this helps some of you. So let's start at the bottom of the spiral, where a victim is blamed for the crime committed against them, okay? Why were you out so late? Why were you wearing that? Why didn't you report? Why did you, make this person angry? Why didn't you get an order of protection? Well, that victim is less likely to report that crime and future crimes, right? And who would blame them, right, if you got that kind of response? So here's where the status quo comes in. People assume victims are lying, they're exaggerating, or they don't deserve justice, or that the crime wasn't as serious as they, made it out to be. So of course, right, the victim doesn't receive the justice they deserve, and perpetrators of these crimes aren't held accountable. So then violent crime continues, okay? So we really, really got to do our work to interrupt it, right? Start at the very bottom of the spiral and not let victims be blamed for what's going on or the crimes that committed against them. So some other quotes from our SHARE committee members. A survivor said, "I felt like I didn't have anyone to anchor me. When I just needed to be told, you're not alone, I hear you, and I believe you." This was in response to the abuse that she endured. And a survivor said this about her family: "They think I'm stupid or that I signed an agreement to being abused." Okay, so we got these messages from various people, systems, family, friends. All right, so how do we go about ending it? Well, part of it is kind of a simple fix, but it's looking at the ways we use our grammar, right? This goes more towards, like, I guess, people involved in the media or those who are reporting certain crimes, either writing an article or reporting it in, a report, an incident report, prosecution report, any of that. So a simple way to start placing responsibility on people who cause harm is to switch up our grammar. And changing the sentence structure to place the responsibility on the perpetrator helps reduce the chances of people blaming the victim. So to kind of visualize this, instead of focusing, right, putting the subject as the victim, we switch it up and we hold that perpetrator accountable. So here are some examples. Jerry was eating cheese when Tom saw him. Jerry was chased and had his cheese stolen. So in this example, who do we hear more of, right? We hear Jerry, right? Jerry, who was the victim in this scenario, he was chased and he had his cheese stolen. But who's absent? Who is the person that we're not talking about? The person actually responsible? Tom. So what we change it up. Tom saw Jerry eating cheese. Tom chased Jerry, and Tom stole Jerry's cheese. Tongue twister there. That's another example. Sam was approached by Steve in an alley. Sam was told to hand their wallet over. Sam tried running away, but Sam was still robbed. Again, Sam is the focus here, right? We totally exclude Steve from this conversation when he is the one responsible. So what do? Let's fix it. Steve approached Sam in an alley. Steve told Sam to hand their wallet over. Sam tried running away, but Steve still robbed Sam. Another tongue twister, man. So here, I hope these examples kind of give you some clarification as to what we mean when we say to switch up our grammar and to really use our language to help hold people accountable. Now, this brings us to another idea or another concept, and this is something that we found through researching victim blaming, where there's this idea of victim defending, where victim defending rejects the premise that victims are partly at fault or must change their ways. So a victim blaming should be criticized for overstating victims' involvement. Victim blaming overstates events of facilitation, precipitation, or provocation. So this just means that victim blaming tends to give this idea that victims either facilitated what happened to them, right? They made it easier. They brought it on themselves, whether it was through their behavior, they were drinking too much, they were wearing this, outfit, or they actually ended up provoking the attack or the assault. We know those things aren't true. Or exhorting people to be more cautious and vigilant is not an adequate solution. So here are some examples, and these examples I got from our staff about the messages that we receive specifically as women to remain safe and to avoid danger. So women should take self-defense classes. How many of you have heard that in your life? You must walk with your keys in between your knuckles. Or don't walk alone at night. Don't go out alone at night, period. Or never go to the bathroom alone, right? If you're at a club or a bar, take your friend. Always have at least a quarter tank of gas in your car, right? You never know what if you have to leave or you're stuck in the middle of nowhere, you want to make sure you have your gas. Always pay attention to your surroundings. Always be on alert. Don't talk to strangers. Always watch your drink, right? You go to the bathroom, take your drink with you. Or you have to wear your purse across your body, right? To not incentivize, I guess, someone from, stealing it from you. Also, don't use your headphones if you're alone, right? If you're out for a jog, and it's dark, or you're in a park by yourself, you want to be sure you can hear what's going on around you. So if you have other examples, feel free to throw that or comment that in the chat box of other things you might have heard growing up or even now as adults, the ways we are given messages, right, of the ways we have to avoid a dangerous situation. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do these things, right? We know we live in a world where these things are necessary, unfortunately. But wouldn't it be nice, right? And I think we can all imagine and strive to build a world where we don't have to do these things, okay? Where, we aren't giving these messages to mostly women, right? At the end of the day, women are the ones who receive most of these messages, that, you have to do something yourself to avoid being attacked, robbed, assaulted, XYZ. Again, right, these things are necessary in our day and age, but let's all build a world where we don't have to communicate these things to our children, to our little girls, to our teens. It shouldn't have to be that way, is my point. Now, through our research, we know the solution is not perfect, right? Whether we focus too much on the victim or we focus too much on the perpetrator, we're kind of left with this imperfect solution. So if the coverage of a news story or, a case of abuse or assault focuses too much on the victim's experience, even in a sympathetic way, researchers found that it may increase the likelihood of victim blaming, surprisingly, because we begin to wonder what they could have done differently that we neglect to focus on the agency of perpetrators, right? So you might have heard of been shared a news article of, a domestic violence situation or a sexual assault that happened in your area. And the coverage focused too much on the victim and, what they were doing, what time of day it was, what their family scenario was, what they were wearing or, drinking or whatever. And that tends to make us wonder, well, I wouldn't have worn that, or I wouldn't have been out that late. Well, it makes sense because in the neighborhood that it happened, sketchy things like that happen. So it is kind of an imperfect solution here. So there came this idea where if we develop stories that focus on the perpetrator of the crime, that could be less likely to provoke this victim blaming behavior. But we know that also has some challenges. If we overemphasize perpetrators, this might lead to an over-empathizing and focusing on the other achievements or attributes. So for those of you who are familiar, right, the Brock Turner case, where he raped a girl behind a dumpster one night. If you remember that case example, it got a lot of media attention, and mostly for the fact that Brock Turner happened to be a star swimmer, right? He was on track to go to the Olympics. He was such a great athlete. He was attending Stanford at the time. So all of these examples came up of the ways that, he was a high achieving person. He had all these skills, and that led to some of that victim blaming behavior, right? Where we kind of excused his actions for the fact that he happened to be also a great athlete. And this could lead to mythologizing perpetrators of crime, right? Where it's difficult to reconcile the fact that seemingly normal people could do bad things, right? And that's really a hard thing to understand and to kind of come to terms with, if you think about it. And we have to ask ourselves, do we betray victims by focusing too much on their perpetrators? So again, right, we just want to deliver this information to y'all. And it's kind of a hard balance. And I think that's kind of the way I look at it, is that's the thing we have to strive for, is a balance. Because we know if we focus too much on either the victim or the perpetrator, victim blaming and things like that are going to come out. But like Doreen mentioned earlier, if we hold true, right, this principle or this belief that nobody deserves to be hurt, right? Nobody in our society deserves to be hurt, abused, assaulted, to experience violence, any of those things, then I think we'll be on the right track in terms of avoiding victim blaming, right? If we can remember that Highwayman story, right? That woman did not deserve to die, no matter how you look at it, right? If we can hold true that belief, then I think we're on the right track. And also we have to consider the ways, power and control dynamics influence these concepts, right? And this quote I took from a researcher who said, violence is all about power and control. Blaming the victim does nothing to address those roots of violence. It does nothing to resolve problems of violence, nor from protecting the victim from further victimization, nor from protecting future generations from violence, okay? So at the end of the day, right, we waste a lot of time blaming the victim, right? When we have to really look at those roots, right? Who misused their power in this situation? Who is trying to control other people or another individual? We look at those roots, right? We get to the bottom of it, of ways we can address those. Then, hopefully we will live in a world where violence isn't occurring. Now that wraps up the presentation and the training. I know it was kind of a shorter one, but We hope that this information was valuable and the examples that we gave kind of clarified some of these topics, because it is important to understand the ways we can, and we all have a role to play, right, in interrupting victim blaming in our work, in our peer circles, especially when we're scrolling, before bed on the news sites and our social media. We know this stuff will come up. So how do we go about interrupting it, right? Now we understand kind of why it happens, but there's ways, right? We can address it through our grammar and through the ways we talk about some of these things. And again, right, the more we understand, the more we can do better, right? And engage in a little bit healthier behavior. So I'm happy to take questions if you all have any. Feel free to write them in the chat box.